Hello, everybody.
Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Nice to see everybody again. I hope you are all doing well. And I'm very happy to see you, though we have finally summertime and we can finally go out in most countries, I believe. I have the pleasure to start the first EWA Talks Exchange of 2021. And I'm very happy also because we focused probably for the first time on a gender equality approach to form and content of films. We used to have a lot of hangouts and talks and conversation about gender equality behind the camera. But today we have Iris Brey, who is a specialist of gender equality in content. I don't know whether it is a good definition, Iris. Yeah. But anyway, we're really honored to have Iris with us. Iris has a PhD in cinema studies from New York University and teaches cinema at the University of California. She is also a film critic with several media, especially French, but she's totally bilingual. And I have discovered Iris really by accident. It was during the last Christmas holidays. And I have read this book in French, Le Regard Féminin, The Female Gaze. And immediately, I was so enthusiastic that I immediately bought the previous one, actually, Sex and the Series. So then I decided we have to have Iris as a guest in our network. And we have to make sure that the content that she has produced is really shared largely, not only in our community, but also beyond. That's why today we have EWA members, but also non-members. Now I give the floor to Iris. Iris will share a presentation, and feel free to write your questions in the chat. So when Iris is ready, is done with the presentation, we will open the floor, read the questions, and interact with her. So welcome, Iris. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I apologize for having to cancel last time, but I actually had COVID and could not even speak. So that's why we had to reschedule. Now that my brain is back and that I can speak again, I'm very happy to be here. And thank you for having me. So the way I constructed the presentation is a very basic PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you. And so there we go. And I thought that it would be just a little bit easier to follow what I've been working on and to have a couple of images and a couple of clips that I'll be putting in the chat when we come to that. I thought that I would just go over the notion of male gaze that Laura Mulvey theorized, and then explain more about my work and how I worked on the book Le Regard Féminin. So to start with the concept of the male gaze, maybe most of you are familiar with it, maybe not. I discovered the term when I was doing my PhD at NYU. And Laura Mulvey wrote this text in 1975 in a publishing a little book called Screen. That was a journal, a film journal. And I remember reading it and having kind of a moment of realizing that most of the films that I adored had always been filming women in the same way as objects. So what Laura Mulvey theorizes in 75 is that as spectators, we identify with the camera that follows the hero's point of view, who takes pleasure in looking at women as objects. Laura Mulvey uses the psychoanalytical framework to explain this, and she bases her analysis on how, as spectators, we identify with the male hero, and our look goes through the camera, and the way the camera is looking is always basically being the hero's point of view. And the way that the hero takes pleasure is by looking at women as objects. And so there's a triangulation that happens between us spectators, the camera, and the hero. And so I'll read the second part that's also from Laura Mulvey's text. But so what Laura Mulvey shows is, and what's really interesting is that, so she bases her analysis in movies from the 50s and 60s, the Hollywood movies. And she sees that there are some cinematic codes that we have seen so many times that sometimes we don't recognize them, but that are actually ways of indicating that the woman is desirable. So for example, a vertical pan, doing this up and down a body, that's a gesture that mimics basically the hero looking up and down. And so when the hero does this, he's looking at a woman as an object, and we understand that this camera movement going up and down signifies that the woman in the film is desirable. But it can also be close-up shots of breast or of an ass that come repeatedly. And that's a way of fetishizing the body and making the female body as parts and not as a whole subjects. And it's, I gave several examples from James Bond to La Collectionneuse by Romer, but also Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Tarantino. There's a shot of a woman just bending over in a car, and the camera is right behind her. And so what's important to me is to understand that the problem with the male gaze is not that it exists, but that it is everywhere. And it can be throughout a film, or it can be very sporadic. It can be a couple of seconds, or it can be the subject of the film. And the problem is that when it's a couple of seconds, we hardly notice it. And we can think, for example, that, for example, a TV series like Game of Thrones has strong female characters. But what I'm interested in is the way they are filmed. And when you start really analyzing the mise en scène and the camera work, you understand that there's always a political message behind the mise en scène and behind the way female characters are filmed. And what is alarming to me is the way that female bodies are always filmed differently than male bodies. So even when a man is considered appealing, very rarely does the camera go up and down a man. Very rarely do we have a close-up shot of his chest or of his ass. So it's this dichotomy between how we film women and how we film men that I'm interested in. And so I'm just gonna, if people still don't know what the male gaze is, I'm just gonna share a first clip of James Bond, which is one of the most iconic films, and to kind of have in mind what the male gaze is like. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna send the link to everybody in the chat, and you can just click and you should be able to watch the clip. So it's very short, and I'll come back right after. Okay, so did that work for everybody? Yes? Yes, okay. So let me go back to sharing my PowerPoint. I don't know, give me a second. let me see how, is this working? Yes? Okay. So James Bond and the way that he's looking at Halle Berry coming out of the water is exactly what Laura Mulvey is theorizing, right? So we're actually looking through his binoculars, and then the shot is indicating with what's called a double iris that we are in his point of view, and there's a slow motion with her coming out of the water, and what the code here, the visual code, is that a man is looking at a woman without her knowing that she's being looked at. And so the man is the bearer of the look. He's the one doing the looking, and the woman is always passive, and she doesn't know that she's being looked at. And this is what Freud calls scopophilia, right? The pleasure of examining a person as an object. And this position of being in the voyeur's position, this voyeuristic point of view is something that keeps on coming back when it comes to staring at women, looking at women, and that is being used, I think, far too often. So I'll just go back to Laura Mulvey's definition. In narrative cinema, the male gaze usually displays the female character, woman, girl, child, on two levels of eroticism, as an erotic object of desire for the characters in the film story, and as an erotic object of desire for the male viewer of the film story. Such visualization established the roles of dominant male and dominated female by representing the female as a passive object for the male gaze of the active viewer. The social pairing of the passive object woman and the active viewer man is a functional basis of patriarchy, right? So Laura Mulvey's theory is really that the male gaze is at the basis of the patriarchy, and that it is the reason why most male directors use the male gaze is to basically because they're afraid of women. That's her point of view, and how she explains the ubiquity of the male gaze, that the women hold too much power, and so we need to make them passive objects in order to keep the patriarchy alive. That's just a couple of examples of how these shots, even in a TV series such as Mad Men, which I find very feminist in itself, just the way that short shots are always there to remind us that women can be taken as objects. And this gratuitous way of filming is always reminding that female characters can be taken. And I also use this little clip of Cate Blanchett at a red carpet event when she says, do you do that to the guys? Because basically all of these camera movements are just so present that we don't even recognize them as camera movements that are actually demeaning for women. But she realizes while she's wearing her gown, that they would never do that to a man wearing a tuxedo. And so this visual grammar that is always distinctive between the male bodies and the female bodies actually also exists in the way that we film red carpets, in pornography, in television, in publicity. And so it's absolutely everywhere. And even when we have, for example, female superheroes, they're always filmed as objects, and always body parts that are shown for them aren't shown for men. So this brings me to why I decided to write Le Regard Féminin. I felt like there was something that needed to be theorized in the lineage of Laura Mulvey, but that wasn't using the same theoretical framework. I wanted to move away from psychoanalysis and the concept of identification and think about the lived experience and the lived body. So in the book, I'm using more of a phenomenology in philosophy. So Merleau-Ponty basically is my theoretical framework, because what I find very important is the way that we feel things and the way that the lived experiences of women are being shown. And the way I worked in order to create like the theoretical framework was something that I had never done before, was to embrace what my physical experience was when I was watching movies. So I come from an academic background, I'm a film critic, and I was always taught to separate my mind from my body and to rely on my intellectual knowledge in order to discuss films. And there was something in that I was kind of fed up with, because I think that there is another way of talking about film, and I think that the way our bodies react to film actually it can be considered valid and valuable in order to understand film. And so the question that I asked myself was, okay, when I'm watching a movie, what movies are making me feel what the heroine, what the female protagonist is going through? And I quite quickly realized that there were almost two categories of films about women. There were the films that were portraying women, but from a distance, right? As an erotic object, as something that was very mysterious, as something that we couldn't really touch, but we were fascinated by. And there were other movies where actually formally in the mise en scène, everything was done so that I could feel what the female protagonist was going through. And so that's how I built the definition of the female gaze, was a gaze that allow us to share the lived experience of a female body on screen. And for me, that's very important. It's not a gaze created by female artists, but rather one that takes the point of view of a female character in order to embrace her experience. Because in Laura Mulvey's text, she was also always thinking of spectators as male, and she wasn't thinking about the experience of female spectatorship. And she was also only quoting films that were done by men in the 50s. And what I realized when I was working on my corpus is that most of the films that are female gaze, in my opinion, are created by women, but some of them are also created by men. And I don't think it's a question of the gender of the person behind the camera. It's really a question of mise en scène and how you want the spectators to feel or look at female bodies. And I'll read the second quote from my book. It seems to me necessary to use the expression female gaze to highlight the experiences of women, because even if we're living in a queer, fluid, and even a trans era, such experiences linked to the female body have not yet been defined. Not putting words to representation of female experiences, not daring to analyze them, is a way of rendering invisible the point of view of a minority. And one of the things that was important to me also when I was thinking about the female gaze is that I didn't want to create a hierarchy between what's considered mainstream cinema and art house cinema. Because I think that as a film scholar and also as a film critic, I was taught very early what films were worthy of being criticized and what films were not even considered as arts. And I really think that if we're going to analyze domination and the ways in which the patriarchy infuses our arts, I think we need to also work on the way that we have established hierarchies in art and in the film industry. And I remember watching Wonder Woman by Patty Jenkins in a really big cinema in Paris, and having a very strong physical reaction to the film. And for me, that was an indication that something was happening and that something very unique actually was happening, is that I was seeing for the first 30 minutes in the film, there are no men. There were no male characters, because the beginning of the film is in this utopic island, and that's where Wonder Woman is being raised, and she's being raised by a group of women that are working together. And what was very surprising to me is that all the women were always active. They were always doing something. And this is to say that I'm not judging the quality of the film. I'm thinking about the experience as a viewer. And for me, there was a very strong emotional response to Wonder Woman, because I realized that that is too rare, and that I want to see that, and I want to experience that in film more often. And so for me, it is a movie that promotes female gaze, because even though Wonder Woman has sexy attributes, she's wearing very short shorts. She has like big. She's considered beautiful by all the norms and the standards, but the way that her body is filmed is never objectified, and so she's always filmed as a character that has access to being active and to be in control of the way that her body is moving. She has agency. So that seemed also a very important part. And then I started questioning myself, wondering, well, okay, is this concept of female gaze something that's contemporary? When can I date it? So I started going back in film history and watching movies with female protagonists. And I went all the way back to Alice Guy. And that was honestly for me a shock, because I realized that movies that portray female experiences have always existed in the history of cinema. And it's not something that is trendy. It's something that has always been there, but that has been buried under other films, or that has disappeared from our history books of cinema, or that have not been celebrated in the way that they should have. And when I started looking into Alice Guy's life, I was at the same time very excited and very sad. Very excited because I discovered films that I think kind of changed my life, and at the same time I was very sad because she died poor and unknown. And so she disappeared while she was still alive, which I find something that's at the same time fascinating and tragic, because what Alice Guy was a secretary, she was working for Gaumont, and she asked basically if she could use a camera after hours. And Gaumont told her, okay, you can have fun with the camera once you're done with all of your work. And so she started making movies very early on, and she's the first person who understood that cinema could be used to tell fiction. So when the Frères Lumière were doing documentaries, she understood that the camera could be used to tell stories, and that there was a power of the narration that could be used in film. And so the idea is extraordinary, right? She's the first one who understands that she's going to create fiction. And she does this with a movie called La Fée aux Choux, The Fairy Cabbage. And Alice Guy, she's done more than 100 movies. We've lost most of them, but she's always been interested in gender roles and in the way women are portrayed in society. So in 1906, she does a movie called The Consequences of Feminism, where women are just smoking cigarettes, playing cards, while the men are doing all the chores. And she decided to move to the States in 1910, I think, and she built her own studio called Solax. So she was the first woman who was directing a film studio in the States. And what happened is that her studio burnt down, and so she lost most of her films. And she learned that her husband was having an affair, so she moved back to France with her 2 children. And when she moved back to France, nobody would give her money, so she was not able to make any movies when she came back to France. And so she died poor and thinking that she was already forgotten, when she's actually the one who changed the history of cinema. And that's the image that I'm using is from a movie called Madame a ses envies, which I find absolutely fascinating. You can watch it on YouTube. It's a short movie of 5 minutes, where you see a pregnant woman who has her needs, and her needs are putting phallic objects in her mouth. And even today, I think that would be very subversive to show a woman who enjoys putting a popsicle inside her mouth, or putting all sorts of objects. And what's interesting to me too is that Alice Guy decided to bring the camera closer to the face of her actress in order for the spectators to be able to feel the pleasure that the actress was having while putting objects in her mouth. So she's actually changing the scale of her frame every time the woman is putting something in her mouth. And the close-up had been used before, but as a comical device. And she's using the close-up for the first time to enhance a dramatic moment. And so she understands that bringing physically her camera closer to the mouth is going to allow us spectators to feel the pleasure of the female protagonist. And what's important to me here is the grammar of desire, because as we've seen with Laura Mulvey, desire has been, through the male gaze, has been linked to objectification. And we've been learning how to desire through objectification. But actually, from the start of cinema, there has been this different cinematic codes where desire and pleasure were actually not linked to objectification, but being able to look horizontally at a female protagonist and to feel her experience as equals, and thinking of the screen as a skin where you can actually almost touch her body. That's what Alice Guy was doing by bringing the camera closer, is that she wanted us to almost feel what this woman was going through. And this woman also is also pregnant, which is something that is actually very rare in film. And so I think that it's very emblematic of all of these tropes that are linked to the female gaze, and to understand that in the history of cinema, it's always been there. So another quote, which I'll go over quickly, is that one of my questions was, how do I name this gaze? Should I name it the female gaze? Should I name it the feminist gaze? Should I name it the queer gaze? Should I name it the lesbian gaze? Because most of my corpus actually has been made by lesbian directors. And I decided to use the word féminin, female, for a couple of reasons. One of them was because I wanted to create a lineage with Laura Mulvey and with all the other women that have been working in film studies. And I wanted to reactivate basically the work of feminists that has been done in the 70s and the 80s. And also I realized that some movies that were portraying women's experiences weren't always feminist films. And also I wanted to give the term female a positive image. And I realized that everything that was linked to female, whether it's the female body or the social body, were experiences that had been dismissed by the patriarchy. And that everything that's linked to the female body, if we're thinking of your breast growing, of periods, of orgasms, abortions, childbirth, menopause, clitorectomy, all of those things are still very, very rarely represented. We can think of also the female experiences. Most women will experience harassment, will experience more than men rape, sexual abuse, being afraid, walking alone at night. And all of those social experiences, because they're linked to being female in society, also are very rarely represented on screen. I wanted to embrace female experiences, and I wanted to question relations of powers and domination, both within the narrative and outside of it, and power relations on set, as well as between viewers and the work, asking what is the power of the one who views, because what I'm trying to defend with the female gaze is that we as spectators are active viewers and have also a responsibility in our interaction, and also between us and the material, and what images we seek and how we find them. And I think that it's important to see us also as active when we're watching a movie. And we have the power of turning our computer off. We have the power of leaving. And I think it's extremely important to have agency as a spectator, and also not find ourselves being trapped as being forced to watch things that no longer suit us. I'm putting an image of Jeanne Dielman by Chantal Akerman because I think for me, Chantal Akerman is one of the geniuses of film, and I think she's as important as Truffaut or as Godard, and she's not being taught enough in film schools. And I think that she has captured in Jeanne Dielman what the gestures of being a woman on a daily basis is. And I don't want to reveal the film too much, but it's also about a woman who works as a prostitute. And I think the way that she's filming sex work is also very new. And for me, it's one of all of Akerman's works is always the filmic form is always saying a political commentary that's very strong. I created kind of this grid that is not perfect, but as a way to kind of help viewers ask themselves questions, to understand that the female gaze is, you have to think about the narrative, but you also have to think of the mise en scène. So in the narrative, then you would have to ask yourself, well, is the main protagonist identifying as a woman? So that means that this also includes trans women. Is the story told from her point of view? Are we inside her body, in her point of view, not looking at her from a distance? And does her story actually troubles the patriarchal order? Is the movie questioning domination? And in the mise en scène, you have to ask yourself, can the narrator feel what the protagonist is going through? Is the erotization of the bodies interpreted as a choice and not as a reproduction of the patriarchal unconscious? This is a very tricky question, but I think that what I've noticed is that most male directors that are actually using the cinematic codes of the male gaze usually do it because they're just used to seeing women filmed this way. So they're just reproducing this gesture and not even thinking about it. And so I think it's a different story when the director actually wants to film women as objects, and that's almost a different subject. And finally, does the spectator's pleasure, when it does not stem from being put in the place of a voyeur, but it can be deployed outside of domination. And that's something that's very important to me, is that I think that there is for me, the revolution of the female gaze is really the fact that we can think about desire and pleasure outside of domination and outside of looking at the other as an object. For example, I believe that Titanic is a female gaze movie. So just to tell you that men can also produce female gaze. If you remember Titanic, it is told from the point of view of Rose, who is an older woman, and you go back into her flashback and you have her own story, and the interaction between her and Jack actually questions domination all the time. And the way the sex scene is shot, it's actually Rose who is much more in charge and active. And even in the scene when she's actually posing naked, the way that she is framed by James Cameron is never as an object, but always as a subject. And he's filming the glances that they're looking at each other. And there's something that's being created at this moment of creating together. So I do think that Titanic is female gaze. I think that the female gaze is a conscious act, and as a result, it produces conscious politicized images. It does not happen by chance, and it's a way of thinking. And as I said, I think that some cinematic techniques are activating the female gaze, making us an active spectator. One of them could be direct address to the camera, such as in Fleabag by Phoebe Waller-Bridge. One can be voiceover that can be used in The Handmaid's Tale. I don't think we have enough time for all of my clips, so I'm going to go through. But basically, what's important to me also in The Handmaid's Tale is the fact that all the rape scenes are always shown from the point of view of the female character, and are never shown from the point of view of the male who is raping. And that's extremely important to me because in the history of cinema, most rape scenes have been shown through the point of view of the rapist and have been eroticized. So I think that having a TV series that has made a conscious choice of always staying with the women that are raped is something that is at the same time very difficult to watch over and over again, but I think is completely necessary to have in order to change the discourse around rape and watching rape as something of an erotic moment, such as in Game of Thrones. Dreams and visions are a way of activating. I'm just quoting Germaine Dulac, La Surveillante, Madame Bedet, and Meshes of the Afternoon by Maya Deren. I think those directors have not been taught enough. At least they were never taught to me. So, and I think they're very important filmmakers. So it's just a way of for me to say their name again. And I'm just going to show you a scene from this movie, Rafiki, that came out in 2018, because I think that it's a film that actually shows you how you can create a sex scene, a lesbian sex scene, without objectification, and also something that we haven't spoken of, but I know we can't talk about everything, is what bodies are being shown, and having people of color is also something, and having their stories is also something that is, I think, in the process of maybe not changing, but at least we're starting to have this conversation. So let's just watch this short clip that's a sex scene that I think is a good way of discovering what a sex scene through the female gaze could be. Okay, so I think I'll end with this idea, right? That I think that having movies that try to put forward the sense of touch, that try to film women as subjects, that put forward experiences that are linked to the lived body of women, is extremely important. And we need today to think about the way that the mise en scène is always telling you a political message, and that massively we've been taught that the women's point of view has no value, that women's experiences have no value. And what I find fascinating looking at the female gaze is how most women directors that are trying to approach female experiences actually changed the history of cinema by using, for example, a close-up like Alice Guy, but also Dorothy Arzner, for example, invented the perche, the perch, when you're doing audio, because her actress was moving too fast on the set, and so they were having problems recording the sound. So there's always like a cinematic invention that comes with this idea of trying to get closer to women's experiences. So to those who think that the female gaze is a way of censorship and of making the male gaze disappear, I think these people can be reassured. The male gaze is always going to exist. The question is not to no longer look at those images, but to be able to be critical, but to also, and more importantly, understand that there's another range of films that have not been taught, that are not shared, that are not in festivals, that aren't in classrooms, that need to be celebrated because they're actually celebrating the value of what being a woman is. So what I'll end with this idea.
Well, thank you, Iris, for the presentation. I would like to ask our participants to put their questions in the chat. I maybe start myself with the question, Iris. You have stressed that the male gaze, as it has been, theoretically described by in the 70s came from psychoanalysis. So to put it simple, that you changed that in your approach, and you went into the experience actually of being a spectator. And since we know that, especially for art house films, most of spectators are women, we need probably also to find our own experiences on screen, and not experiences that are being told by the male gaze, let's put it like this. So however, as we were a little bit saying before we started this session, you are well aware that there is a strong reaction to whatever touches upon content in the audiovisual, I mean, films and TV series, because there is this feeling that art is art and you cannot really define it. And whenever you want to put this kind of let's say grids or interpretations, you limit freedom of expression. So on a personal level, how you think your work has been received by by the current context, I mean, which is quite favorable to gender equality, let's put it like this. I mean, you come up with this female gaze test at a very favorable period in history. Right. But being also a French woman, let's be very, very direct, and having here in France well-known actress, not to call her, who said that women should have the freedom to be touched freely in the underground. I mean, this is a little bit a context where you might have been criticized. So I would like you to share a little bit what has been the reaction you have found.
Well, I find that my book is creating a lot of discussion, which I find exciting, because I think I wrote a book about mise en scène and people are really arguing over it. So I think that whenever you create discussion, it means that at least you're stirring something up. But I'm also receiving very violent reactions, because I think I'm talking about intimacy and I'm talking about domination. So at the same time, I'm very happy because the book has found its public, and I'm also very moved by the messages that I get on Instagram from a younger generation of men and women. So I feel like there was a need to put words onto experiences, and that's why at least the book is being discussed. And so I think that's a good thing. But the resistance that the book is receiving is linked to, as you said, all the questions of freedom of expression and censorship. What I found when I was writing this book is that the question, I think, is not being asked the right way. Because when I see that most of the women directors that have done amazing work that is featured in my book, most of those women aren't part of the main exhibits at the Cinémathèque. They are not even taught in our film history books. So where is the censorship? Is the censorship on the side of a couple of men that feel threatened by the fact that we're saying that other movies exist and other women directors exist? Or is the censorship actually a historical one of all women's works in every art, right? This is not just about film. This is about art history. And this is about who we see in our museums. Where is the censorship? It's not on the men's side, I can tell you that. Second of all, when you talk about freedom of expression, what I find is that when the directors are looking for female gaze, they're always reinventing the filmic form, because they have to work outside of the codes and outside of the dominant codes. So that means that they need to think about new ways of showing things, because they don't want to just be in the reproduction of cinematic codes that have always been based on objectification. So saying that it is the freedom of expression is being limited, I think is really the wrong way of seeing it, because actually people that are thinking about the way we're filming sex scenes and women's bodies are reinventing the art. So that is a very exciting thing. If you want to continue to film women as objects, of course, that's your right and that's your freedom. But don't feel threatened by women and artists that are actually trying to do things in a different way or to reinventing art. So I think that the people that use those arguments are afraid of losing their power. And I think that the people who are using those arguments are afraid of looking at what domination means in their intimacy. And I think those are very touchy things to say, even publicly, but I do really strongly believe them. I think for me, writing this book had a transformative effect. I think that I can no longer watch the same movies the same way. And there is something about letting go of a certain cinephilie, of certain directors that I adored. But today, of course, it's difficult to let go of that and to no longer find pleasure in watching those films. But there's great joy in knowing that there's all these other movies that exist and that I find today much more exciting. And I think also that saying that as viewers, we can evolve throughout our lifetime, and that that is something that's joyful. That is not something that we should be afraid of or that we should be seeing in a negative light. It's something that's part of the human experience of not always cherishing the same 10 men that have done these films. You know, that I think that's the way I was brought up, and that's the way I learned how to desire. And now I don't want to do that anymore. And so I'm looking at new material, and I'm also, I think desire, yeah, I think my own way of desiring has evolved greatly.
Thank you. So we have some questions in the chat. I'm going to read them loud. So the first question is the book available in English?
Yes, so I'm waiting to see if the book is going to be translated by an American university press at the moment.
Right. So then what do you think about the film Portrait of Lady on Fire, which is in your book for sure? And maybe I would add against La Vida del Baikishisha, maybe make a comparison between the two perspectives, yeah. But I'm asking too much probably. And then there is a question about Fleabag or I Hate Susie. What do you think about Fleabag?
I really like, I mean, I think Fleabag is brilliant, because I think that what Phoebe Waller-Bridge is doing with the way that she's addressing spectators and the way that she's working this cinematic technique throughout the seasons is something, once again, that's very inventive and that is making us, as spectators, active viewers. The Fleabag at first was a play, and so she was sitting on a stool and talking to the public. And I think that's something that she was able to translate with the direct address, which is really smart, because it's a way of always making us feel like we share this humor with her, but not just that, because at the end of season 2, she talks to us as if we're her friends, right? And we're replacing the friend that she has lost. So I think there's something very emotional on the way that she's using direct address and the way that she's making us enter her own intimacy, just as a friend would enter our own intimacy throughout time. And I think also that's what's interesting about TV series, is that you actually have the time to create this intimacy and to become an active viewer. So I end my book with actually Fleabag and the end of season 2 of Fleabag. And I do start the book with Portrait of a Lady on Fire, because when I finished writing the book was right after Cannes 2 years ago. So at the same time, there was the screening of the Céline Sciamma movie, and there was the screening of the Keshish movie, which is called Mektoub, My Love, the second facet of the film, which was never released. But for me, that was really interesting because it was two opposite ways of filming desire, and also, I think, two opposite ways of treating us as viewers. I think in the Siama movie, there's a lot of humor as well. And so, for example, when after an hour and a half of the movie, there's a man who enters the kitchen, the way the director films it is as a jump scare, right? So it's actually codes of the horror film that are used at that moment. And so the reaction in the audience is to laugh because we're scared of a man entering the room because we got used to the fact that no men were there. So for example, for me, that's extremely funny, but also extremely brilliant because it's using codes of a genre that's the horror movie and applying it to men, and also making us active at the same time because we're just like the characters and we got used to living in a world free of men. And I think that Keshish, on the contrary, in his last movie that is shot in a nightclub, I felt forced to being in the nightclub. There's a sex scene that's almost 15 minutes of a man going down a woman, and it's an oral sex scene shot in an extreme close-up. And for me, that looked more like a torture scene, honestly, than a sex scene. And I felt forced by the way it was shot, the close-up, and the fact that it was so long, and the fact that the actress seemed to not take any pleasure in it. I felt that was very coercive in the way of treating me as a spectator. And so I think those are very different approaches as artists in the way we consider spectators.
There is a comment. I recognize this so much as a documentary filmmaker working with a male cameraman. I would love to share. So thank you for the comment. Then we have more questions. How would the female gaze conceptually, like you theorized it, work with a trans gaze or a non-binary gaze? By the way, there is a chapter in your book about the male gaze queer, that what you call it. Yeah.
That's a really great question. And I think that's a question that is being discussed and has been discussed before. Actually, and I touch upon it also in my conclusion, but Jack Alberstam wrote a chapter on what the trans gaze was, but the way it has been theorized up until now is really on the basis of identification with a trans character. But I think that, for example, the documentary Disclosure on Netflix is for me much more interesting because it's actually thinking about the filmic form and how we represent trans characters. I think that the way I'm trying to theorize female gaze could be used to theorize other gazes. And also for me, the definition that I give is not something that's static. I think that what's important to me is that it's something that's also in movement and that's also changing for myself. So I see it as a very porous notion. So I do think that thinking about a trans gaze or a non-binary gaze could be linked to my work. But the other question that we need to ask ourselves is what material do we have, and do we have enough material to theorize it, which raises another question of what characters do we have in our film history, and that would ask also a lot of research. So yes, I think that it's very important to continue to think about how we film trans people and trans bodies and non-binary people. Yeah.
So how has your research changed your idea of what quality is? Being a film critic myself, I've been torn between thinking that a film is feministic important, but not necessarily good film. How do you also as a critic navigate between wanting more people to watch films by and about women without compromising your idea of quality? So this is a big issue, quality coming back again and again.
Yeah, well, for me, actually, it's not an issue because I think that most feminist films actually always are thinking about the filmic form and are always inventing something. So I have very rarely been confronted to a film or a TV series that I found feminist and that I didn't find good. I think that most feminist pieces of art are good because they're thinking about the filmic form. And I even think that most masterpieces are feminist films because they're changing my perception of the world. And I think that a film or a TV series that calls itself feminist just because it has a strong woman character is not a feminist film or series. I think that a feminist piece of art is a narration that questions domination within the narrative, but also within the form. And even if I pushed it further, also on set. I was really interested in a TV series called I Love Dick, for example, that was created by Sarah Gubbins and Joey Soloway, where for the first time the TV series was written by 10 women and non-binary people, and we were in 2018. That had never been done in Hollywood before, whereas I can tell you a lot of writers' rooms are only done by men. And I think that Joey Soloway and Sarah Gubbins, in the way of shooting and thinking about the atmosphere on set, I think that there is something that you can sense or feel by the way that the images are being created and not stolen. Mm. And I think that especially in the sex scenes, not stealing something from an actor or an actress, but creating with the actor or the actress is something that you can feel as a spectator. Mm. And so, yeah, so I think the question of quality for me is not some, I mean, I don't promote movies by women just because they're by women. I try not to trash movies by women because I try not to trash other women publicly, but when I'm actually writing about movies or feminist movies, it's often because I feel very passionate about them.
So another question, it is important to show desire and pleasure indeed, but what about the way of approaching violence against women and women suffering? What are the most important points to be aware, and what is your position? Any example?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I personally think that it's extremely important to be able to portray representations of violence against women, because I think that rape culture has been based on the fact that rape has been portrayed by women being raped in a dark alley by a stranger while they're wearing a short skirt and they're drunk, and then it's their fault. Basically, that's the main narrative. Or having a rape scene that is seen where the woman says no, but then at the end she says yes, and though maybe she wanted it. So those are the two main narratives. I think that portraying rape and also incest, the way it actually happens in our society, meaning that the people who rape are men 98% of the time, and they are men who we know. And I think that a TV series like I May Destroy You is very important in the way that a rape victim is gonna take agency over the experience of rape and how it's actually gonna affect not only her, but also her friends. And I think of another movie made by Ida Lupino in 1950 in the States called Outrage, where her character is raped, but it's really about the post-traumatic stress of rape. I think that the question of violence against women is so ubiquitous, it happens to so many women, that it's crazy to me that it's not more present in our fiction, and that I think it's very difficult to recognize what violence is when you've never seen it before. So I was reading an article that was really interesting in The Guardian about Aziz Ansari, who's the creator of a TV series called Masters of None. And when the Me Too movement arrived, one woman said that she felt that she had been forced by Aziz Ansari to have a sexual encounter. And he reacted saying that he was so surprised. And the article was thinking about the way that women are just used to having bad sex. And by bad sex, that means being forced to do things that don't really give us pleasure. And the idea of pain is extremely present in the way that we have sexual encounters. And so, right, as I think the question is that we don't have enough representations of what sex could be without coercion or domination. So we don't even know what it looks like. So we don't even know what it could be like. And so I wrote this book also that just came out in France for teenagers, because I think that in a world that's dominated by free porn, where most of the narration in pornography is pleasure taken by taking women as objects, but also there's a lot of violence against women's bodies in pornography. I think it's extremely important to say that there are other ways of feeling excitement, of feeling desire, of sharing pleasure, and that it's important to represent violence from the point of view of the women, to understand that it's not erotic, it's actually violence.
Is asking, I would love to hear what you think about separating the art from the artist.
Yeah.
So.
I'm just seeing what's the title of the book for the teenagers. It's this one we were discussing right before. It's called Sous nos yeux. It's a French title, and it's also illustrated by Myriam Mal. The question of separating the art from the artist is something that I have been, it's a question that I've been confronted to in France around the question of Roman Polanski. I personally think that this question is only asked when the artist is accused of being a rapist. It's never asked when a man is accused of being a racist, for example, you know? So we're only asking this question in the context of the artist being maybe a rapist or someone who's abused a child. Just to give you an example with Polanski. Polanski, when you look at the way he's doing the promotion of his film, he says that his personal life actually shaped the way he wrote the film, right? So male artists are always saying also that their intimate life, their personal lives is shaping the way they're telling their story and their movies. So it's difficult to separate when the artist is saying himself that his own private life has an influence. Second of all, if you look at Polanski, he recognized that he had sex with a 13-year-old woman. If you look into, I actually read the testimonies that are available on the internet. And the testimony of this 13-year-old girl is very clear. He drugged her, she had too much to drink, and he had anal sex with her because he was afraid that she could get pregnant. And there's even a moment where she tries to say that Polanski went down on her and gave her cunnilingus, but she doesn't know how to pronounce it because she's 13 years old. So when I read this testimony, I ask myself, what stories are we hearing? What stories are being told, and who has the power to tell them? I think that most stories are being always told from the dominant point of view, and that is a white male. I think that the question of separating art from the artist is never questioned when it comes to female artists, where it's always asking about motherhood and the place of children. And, you know, the personal is all, if you look at a magazine and it's a women artist, always the personal is present. So I think this is a very gendered question. And I do not believe that you can separate, actually, the art from the artist. And I just was listening to a podcast about the artist Picasso. right? And how his misogyny is actually omnipresent in his work as an artist. So it is disagreeable to think about these things, but you know, if you watch, it's the same thing with Woody Allen. If you watch the documentary series made by that's on HBO, made by Dylan Farrow, I'm interested in Dylan Farrow's story. I'm not saying that maybe it's the truth, but it's her truth. And why would her truth not have as much value as Woody Allen's truth? Because he's an artist? Would we say the same thing if it was the butcher? So that's the question that we have to ask ourselves, in what stories we value and what point of views we value, and why, because it's a male genius, all of a sudden they get another treatment. So I personally no longer watch Woody Allen's movies, because when I see his films, I think about Dylan's story and I have her words in my mind. I no longer watch a Polanski movie, because when I hear his name, I have Samantha Gamer's story in my head. And for me, those stories have value. And that's my personal point of view. And I'm not saying that everybody should do this. I think it's very personal, and I think it's where you come from in your own story and the way you interact with art. But yeah.
Yeah, is anyone there? Yes, we have Elisa. Can there be a female gaze of a male body character?
Yeah.
Second question, do you think that there is something we could call a female narrative as opposed to a male narrative, the so-called hero's journey?
Yeah, I think the question of the female gaze on the male body is a very interesting question. It's something that I think is fascinating. And I was watching a movie called Beach Rats by Elisa Itman, who did this year Rarely, Never, Sometimes, Always, where I think that she actually films her male protagonist through the female gaze. But that's almost like something different. And I think that's something that's super interesting. And I don't know if we should call that female gaze or not. I mean, I don't have like all the answers, but I do think that being able to actually have other discourses about what being a hero is, what being manly is, feeling what the men go through, and having portraits of heroes that aren't men that want to dominate, is something that's too rare, but that does exist, obviously. And I think it would be great to have a book that actually, or have a documentary that explores that, a different type of masculinity and being able to be within their bodies. But it's not something that I have encountered that much. And then for the female narrative, for me, I don't think in opposition. I don't think that a female narrative would be like the opposite of a male narrative. I don't think that the female gaze is the opposite of the male gaze. I think that it's a different regime of images. It's a different perspective, right? It's not just thinking in ways that we can just do an inversion. It's always interesting to have a female character, you know, like you have a male character written and all of a sudden it's a woman who plays it and what it changes. Yes, but for me, it has to be something different. It's not just an inversion. It's like it's creating a new world.
When you said you had a strong physical reaction when you saw Wonder Woman, what do you mean by physical? So now we are going into definitions.
I actually felt my body go towards the screen. I felt, a bodily experience. So I felt like I wanted to be with them. I felt actually emotional, like I actually felt moved by the fact that I was seeing so many women, and I felt like I was there with them. And that's the world that I wanted to live in. So I think it's just acknowledging the the sense of physicality that we have in our bodies as spectators. And interestingly, usually, you know, we mock people that faint in movie theaters. We mock people who cry, right? It's something that we should be embarrassed by. But I think all the contrary. I think that that's the power of film, is actually for us to cry, for us to laugh, for us to faint, for us to interact and not just be passive in front of our screens. And I think that's what I missed the most during COVID, was also that experience of having the screen in front of me and having the emotion of the sound and the image that comes together with my own body and with my own story. So that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah. I think it's time for us to wrap up. And thank you very much, Iris, for this powerful sharing. And I think that what you are doing is really crucial for the industry as well, to push the boundaries also of form and narrative. I think this is really the next conversation, and I agree that we should also move forward to discourse which is more inclusive, because I think that in your book, what I really understood from your book, that the female gaze at the end of the day is more inclusive than a male gaze.
Yeah.
So, and inclusivity is really what we need behind, but also and mostly probably in front of the camera, because representation is so strong and it's growing stronger. So thank you very much also for the new book. I will buy it because I have a teenager at home, so I think it's important that for the parents, but also for the children. And thank you everybody for being with us. And the next, I leave Alessia maybe announce our next hangout, because I don't have the details in mind, and then we close up. Thank you, Iris.
Yeah, it will not be exactly a hangout, but on Tuesday 29th, we are having a panel about catching up with intimacy coordination subject. And it will be very interesting because we will have two intimacy coordinators, an actor and a director, talking about how to create a safe set on directing in intimate scenes. And then on July 5th, we'll have another hangout. Yeah, this is going to be just for EWA members, about ins and outs of a first class festival. And well, that's our next two talks over the next 3 weeks. For those who are not EWA members, please sign up to our news so that you can catch up with our events and what we are doing. Most of you here are EWA members, so you're already in the loop, but for this couple who are not, please do it. And thank you, Iris. It's been wonderful to listen to you, and I hope for the English version of your book.
Yes, I hope so too. Bye, have a good night.
Ciao, ciao.